And thank you to everybody for joining me today. I've seen some of those comments from all over the world there. It's lovely to see. Lots of nice comments about my kitchen. Yes, thank you for that as well. Yes, we did give it a little bit of a clean and a tidy. It doesn't always look this tidy. I also do have a dog in the kitchen as well. He's next to the back door there. He's currently chewing on a chew, so he should be all right. But if you do hear some barking, he's probably spotted a squirrel or something out in the garden there. So you'll have to bear with us on that if that does happen. So yes, thank you very much. My name is Chris, and I'm going to talk today about being a reluctant reader. This isn't going to be so much an instructional video in terms of, giving advice or tips to how to deal with reluctant readers, because I'm assuming we're going to ask later on, but I'm betting that there's going to be lots of teachers, maybe numbers of librarians out there as well, and I know just how experienced you people are, how well educated and all that, and you certainly don't need somebody like me telling you how to do your job. I'm also married to a teacher. She's a head teacher now, so I am very much aware of how brilliant all teachers and librarians, how hard they work. So I'm going to talk more about my experiences of being a reluctant reader, and how that kind of changed over the years, because now I write books, so it couldn't be much more of a change. So if this will work, I will go up on to show you my presentation. So there we go, excellent stuff. So yes, so I was a reluctant reader too. The story of a Collins Big Cat author. Now, yes, so what I have been doing recently is writing a whole series of books for Big Cat, which has been fantastic to write. They are called Shinoy and the Chaos Crew. Now, I hope this doesn't come across as a sales technique or anything like that. I am going to be talking more about the books later on, but they do fit in quite nicely as to what I'm talking about. So we've just released 24 copies of these books, 24 different versions. 7 of them were written by another fantastic, wonderful writer called Zoe Clark. Because 24 is quite a lot for any one person to write, certainly in a relatively short space of time. But I had lots of fun writing these. These have all been illustrated by a wonderful illustrator called Amit Teal, who has done some fantastic stuff. So very proud to have these out and about. If they're not in your neck of the woods just yet, I'm sure they will be very soon. They've only just come out, and I've been very busy writing another series of graphic novels with Shinoy in the Chaos Crew as well. So they are coming out very soon. And there's non-fiction books as well. So there's almost too much Shinoy. Anyway, I will talk a little bit more about that later on. So a little bit before I released these Shinoy books, I wrote 5 years ago, I wrote my first book, and that was a story called The Great Chock-a-Plot. Now here's a picture of my daughter holding the very first copy of The Great Chock-a-Plot that we got, because I wrote this story for my daughter as a Christmas present. Originally, that's all this was meant to be. It was just something to make her giggle at bedtime. So I was very lucky and very honoured that it got picked up by a publisher and became a real book. And there's a picture of my daughter in a bookshop, and the very first time we saw it in a bookshop on a shelf, which was a very special day. And it's lovely to see it there next to the books like Harry Potter and Roald Dahl and A Diary of a Wimpy Kid and Jacqueline Wilson. So this was a great honour to have a book published. Now this meant that this thrust me into a completely different world that I was used to. I certainly don't come from a booky kind of a world at all. But once this book was released, I ended up visiting lots and lots of schools. I would go to schools to talk about my book, but also meet readers of all different abilities. Some people who didn't read much, because my book was often used for people who didn't read much, because it was about chocolate, and that's an easy subject to engage people with. And it's a very silly story and very easy to read. So a lot of people used my book to develop their reading abilities, and just to have a bit of fun, really. And I used to go into lots of libraries as well. um, with lots of festivals and reading schemes and lots of different things like that. And it was a great honour to go to bookshops as well. I mean, that's something that I think anybody who does any writing dreams of, going into a bookshop and having a massive queue of eager people wanting to have a signed book. I can't claim to have had a massive long queues, but I've been very lucky. I've had the occasional queue, and it's still very much a thrill to sign, put a little scribble in a book and give it to an excited child, and hopefully they're going to go away and enjoy that. But also done lots of festivals and different things like that. And I mean, there's a picture of me at the Roald Dahl Museum. I was invited to do some events in the Roald Dahl when they were celebrating Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, because my book fits in quite well with a very chocolatey theme. And I was due to go back last year as well to do some more events, but obviously all those kind of things got cancelled. So as well as meeting teachers and librarians and lots of readers, I was also thrown into this world where I met lots of authors. And there's a picture of a group of authors there. We all published books at the same time as each other. So we ended up doing a number of events together. And when these people were introducing themselves and just generally chatting, I found out that they came from very, very different backgrounds than I came from. I was talking to people who previously worked in places like the Royal Opera House, the National Theatre. You know, these people had first-class degrees from fancy universities and from English literature or Shakespeare. They'd studied all these wonderful things. Other people were previously poets and playwrights before they become authors. One of my friends there, grew up in Malaysia and Hong Kong. I mean, hopefully we've got maybe some people from Malaysia and places like that now, but these were places far removed from the world that I came from. And they would talk about going on expeditions to Paris and Rome to visit art galleries. Now, this was not something that I'd ever even dreamed about. I didn't think people like that really existed. And there's a gentleman there right in the front, and he's a very famous person in the children's publishing world. He's a man called Barry Cunningham. Now, he's very famous because he helped Roald Dahl write a lot of his stories, a lot of his books. And he also discovered a certain person called J.K. Rowling. So without Barry, there would be no Harry Potter in the bookshops. The whole Harry Potter phenomenon wouldn't have happened without Barry. So it was fantastic working with him, and he helped me edit my book as well. He even allowed me a little mention of Willy Wonka in the book as well. So it said it made him laugh. So that's one of my treasures, that Barry laughed at my little joke about Willy Wonka. But anyway, so I was mixing with these kind of people that could not have come from more of a different world than I came from. So we're going to go back in time a little bit now, and I'm going to show you the world where I came from. Now, it looks like we've gone back in time to 1880, judging by that photograph there. This is more likely to be about 1980. But I've chosen this photograph because it looks very old. It sort of sums up my youth a little bit there. I'm in my backyard of my house. I'm with my good friend there, Darren, and we took this photograph using a biscuit tin, turned it into a pinhole camera, and we had to sit perfectly still for 10 minutes while this photograph managed to create an image on a bit of paper. And I think we spent most of those 10 minutes wondering why neither of us had a girlfriend. But I think it sums up my youth quite nicely there. So I grew up in a town called Wallsend in the north of England. And it was it still is, a very working class kind of a town. Very much based on industry. We had a coal mine, but that closed down when I was very young, and things like that have a huge effect on a town. It affects the jobs, it affects how much money people have got. Shops closed down and things like that. But we were lucky enough to have a shipyard at the end of pretty much at the end of the road from where I lived. I mean, Wallsend is actually famous because, well, maybe not famous, but Another person who come from Wallsend, who you might know, is Sting from the Police. So anyway, he comes from Wallsend as well, and he did a whole album about the shipyards and everything. Anyway, I am getting off topic there, but I grew up in this very much a working class kind of background, and my dad worked every hour he could. He worked as much overtime as he could. And just to pay the bills. You know, we often struggled to pay bills. You know, we lived in a very basic kind of a house. My mum was disabled, and I would then spend a lot of time of my youth helping her. You know, so that took up a lot of my time. I'm saying all these things because it does kind of have a little feature when I'm going to talk about reading in a moment, about the impact that it did have on reading, all these kind of aspects of not having much money, having responsibilities at home, and all those kind of things. So, but when I did eventually leave Wallsend, when I grew up a bit, I joined the military. I was in the Royal Air Force for quite a while, fixing aeroplanes and, you know, traveling all over the world. And my squadron was responsible for keeping the skies above our country safe. If anybody tried to invade our airspace, then the sirens would go off and we would have to launch jets and make sure that nobody came too close to us. Usually they'd be false alarms, but sometimes in the Cold War, you know, real things did happen. So, but I spent a good few years working with engines and working with, you know, hydraulics and very much getting my hands dirty. And I left the Air Force and I became an environmental scientist. I got very interested in the environment, but in a very industrial kind of a way. And I spent a lot of time up on factory roofs, measuring pollution, which basically meant sticking probes in chimneys and having equipment and checking that these factories weren't polluting too much. You know, so just basically spending a lot of time on factory roofs, usually in the wind and in the rain in the north of England. And also, I used to work inside factories. You know, I used to work inside big car factories, and I used to test all their environmental systems. So basically, my background was very much industry, getting your hands dirty, very, very far removed from these people who'd studied Shakespeare and went to art galleries. So I often found small talk very difficult with these people. But after I did all this, I then became a stay-at-home dad. My wife was a teacher, class teacher at this time. And because I was traveling around quite a bit, working long hours, we decided that when our daughter was born, that I would be the one that brought her up. It just made sense for a number of reasons. And this was a wonderful opportunity, but my life couldn't have changed much more from the industry to being at home. But this is an important part of my life because this is when stories became part of my job. And this is where, you know, we'd read stories together, we would write stories together. And this is what led to me writing the story of the Great Chocopot. You know, it was just, as I said, to make her laugh at bedtime, but very lucky that it was picked up. Now, I'm saying all this because this led to quite an important moment, really, because when the book was released, I got interviewed by a journalist just for the local newspaper, and I was expecting just a little paragraph to appear in the local newspaper. A local boy publishes new book, kind of a thing. But during the interview, he asked me what was my favourite book when I was a child. And I struggled with this. So I basically said, well, I didn't really read much as a child, so I didn't really have a favourite book. And the subject kind of moved on to something else, and I didn't really think too much of it. But when we saw the newspapers, when it came out, the journalist had picked up on this point, had picked up on this unusual aspect for somebody who'd released a book. And it didn't necessarily become a worldwide viral story, but it made the news in lots of different ways that I wasn't quite expecting. We were on the cover of the local news. We had the 3-page spread, and this journalist had really picked up on this point of as it says there, how a reluctant Wallsend reader got the J.K. Rowling treatment. Dad's career takes a literary twist. You know, the subheading there is a slow reader who discovered a love of reading alongside his daughter. Now, it looks a bit big-headed, me putting up those kind of pictures and those images there, but it's to make a point that this was when I started to think that this must be quite unusual for it to make the kind of headlines in the way that it did. And I really started to think about my past, about how, you know, how I didn't used to read and how that was actually quite a thing, especially for somebody in my position now. So to talk a little bit about how I was a non-reader to a reader. So I showed you there a picture about my home life, and you know, I grew up in this kind of a working class situation, and I grew up in a house where we didn't have books around us. My dad wasn't a reader, my mum wasn't a reader, and when I do tell people that, they're often a bit shocked, as if, oh, you must have had a terrible childhood. And I didn't. I mean, things weren't necessarily easy, but they're not easy for a lot of people. I was very lucky that I had a mom and dad who loved me. You know, I grew up in a very warm and loving family, but they just weren't readers. And I think that's an important point. And sometimes getting that across when you do meet young children who don't read, there could be lots and lots of reasons for why they don't. And this was certainly my experience. I didn't read much because there wasn't books in the house. The only books that we did have in the house were these very, very crusty, boring looking books that had probably been handed down to us from a great uncle who'd maybe passed away, and they were just boring looking books, very brown and crusty. They smelled quite a bit from what I remember. You know, they'd probably been in the house for 60 years of somebody smoking cigarettes, maybe, because that's what they smelled like. So they didn't smell very nice, they didn't look very nice, they had very boring titles. So for a long time, that was my view of books. And we didn't really have, you know, bedtime reading wasn't really a thing. We didn't have books. My mum and dad weren't readers. It doesn't mean that we didn't have stories at bedtime. My dad was quite a good storyteller. He could just tell you a story about what had happened at work that day. So we did have those kind of communication, but it wasn't with books. I just wasn't around books. And also because I was very much responsible for helping my mum and helping her with her difficulties, and you know, so that was quite a full-time job as well. So I was busy doing that, you know, in the evenings and the weekends while my dad wasn't around, while my dad was at work. So, you know, I think these are quite significant contributing factors as to why I didn't read that much. And I think even when I did get time to read, I think there was a certain amount of anxiety about reading. You know, I never really got that sort of free space. You know, if I was reading something, I'd be quite worried about my mum. If I did hear a bang downstairs, I'd be worried in case she fell over or something like that. So it's, you know, reading wasn't really an option for me. You know, it's and I'm very envious of people who not only have the time to read, but also have the headspace, that freedom, that, you know, without anxieties, or the kind of people who can put those anxieties to one side. And I know for a lot of people that reading helps put those anxieties to one side. And certainly the kind of year that we have had lately, you know, some people have struggled reading. There'll probably be a few people out there who think, yes, I've maybe had some time to read, but I just haven't been able to think about it. All the things that are going on stopped that. But or some people have read. So it's you know, these kind of anxieties do affect people in different ways, and I think it was definitely a reason why I didn't read so much. And we used to get, you know, the homework, and always had time limits for the homework, and you know, it was always felt reading was something that was very much a pressure situation. So yes, just so if I can just go on to something. If this kind of works again there, pop this back up here. Right, okay, so this is maybe the point. If I can ask the question to everybody out there, you know, what sort of job do you have? How would you consider yourself to be? Are you a teacher? Are you a librarian? Or are you just generally a reader? Is that something that you can put in your chat box? Is that okay? So yes, so just to get an idea of who I'm kind of talking to here. So you know, are you a, you know, I'm sure there's going to be lots of teachers.
You've got a bookworm as well, teacher and a bookworm.
Teacher and a bookworm. Okay, excellent.
An early years English as a second language teacher.
Right, right.
Let me see. An avid reader. So we've got a mixture of readers, a mum as well.
Right.
Lots of English as a second language teachers.
Right.
Primary teachers, a coordinator, primary school.
Okay. Okay, all right. Well, yes, excellent. It was just to get a picture of who's listening out there. So yes, I did assume that there was going to be, you know, a number of teachers out there, you know. So again, I wouldn't dare tread on your toes and try to explain things to you. Just trying to give you my own version of what it was like being a reluctant reader. So if I can show you another picture now of a page in a book. Now, I'm not sure quite what language this is, it doesn't really matter, but whenever I used to look at a book, this used to really, not necessarily scare me, but my heart would sink quite a bit at seeing this. This was something that was very, very hard work to deal with. I mean, I could read, I'm not dyslexic or have any kind of logistical problems with the reading. But it was just still very much hard work. This was something to kind of translate and to put together. And because of the books that we quite often read at school, the books were quite boring, to be quite honest. You know, maybe some of the classics that I'm sure older people or experienced readers really, really love. But if you're not an experienced reader, they are very, very hard work. So I would see a page like this and, you know, I would just sink. It was, you know, a lot of pressure to read this. Sometimes we would have to do book reviews at school. And there was pressure. We maybe had 2 weeks to read a book and to do a review on it. And I hated that. I really hated that. Books were something that always caused problems to me. You know, I was very pleased when if I did finish a book, or I could close the page and just go back and do something far more interesting. So, you know, it was just a very difficult process for me. But you know, I did read, you know, I did have some kind of reading material at home. And I'll give you some examples of these. And all these things do count as reading, of course they do. But I used to get every year, or, you know, I used to get their annuals. And one of my favorite TV programs was The $6 Million Man. I don't know if there's anybody else old enough out there to remember that program, but about a bionic man. And I used to dream of having adventures with Steve Austin, the bionic man. Maybe I could be the bionic boy. And I loved, you know, looking at these annuals. And these annuals would be partly comic strips. They might have little short stories in there. There'd be little quizzes, maybe, and sort of behind the scenes, you know, shots as well. But they weren't very big, you know, and I used to get these maybe once a year. So it wasn't something, you know, I wasn't surrounded by these books. Star Wars was a big thing. I mean, it still is a big thing, but it just came out. I was maybe 8-year-old when it first came out at the cinema. So these books were, you know, very, you know, were all over the place, and one of the few things that I would read. Yes, if you can hear some squeaking there, that's just my dog in the background there. Yes, he has just woken up. So apologies for that. And also one of my favourite programmes was The Professionals. Again, I'm not sure if this is something that's gone all over the world, but this was a very action and adventure kind of a TV programme. So I used to get an annual for that as well. Now, these definitely count as reading as far as I'm concerned, but I would only get them, you know, once a year. This would pretty much be my reading. You know, I didn't get books at any other time of the year. So this was my reading material. So I, you know, and it's a very special thing to own your own book. It's something that now, as I'm a bit older, I do enjoy owning things a lot more, because we didn't have much money, back then. So I didn't own much. And I think that does make a difference when you do own a book. It is something that's very much special. Now, also in terms of, TV as well, there's a lot of TV connections with my reading. In the UK, there used to be a TV program called Jack and Ori. Now, this was basically, we used to get celebrities, famous people reading stories. Now, it was one of those programs which I must admit I used to watch, but it wasn't one of my favorite programs because it was about books, and books to me were just boring. And this was a program about somebody reading a book, holding a book up. There was no real animation or dramatic music or anything like that. It was just somebody reading a book. So it was something that I would watch while I was really waiting for another program to come on, because we didn't have many channels back then. But there was one book that suddenly caught my attention, and it was a book called The House That Sailed Away. Now, I can't remember who read this story out loud, but it was just something that really caught me. We're all hoping for this book that does make a connection with a reader. And I think there's probably a few reasons why this one did. It was the kind of house that I lived in, a very ordinary house on an ordinary street. It was maybe the similar kind of family. But it was also this wacky and crazy adventure that it rained so much that the house lifted up and sailed away down the street. And I just loved it. I loved this whole idea. And I loved it so much that I went to the library to try and get a copy of this. I did get a copy of this. So it's the first time I remember actually going out to get a book to read. So this, so it is quite a special moment. And I, remember being excited, reading ahead of the next day's program to find out what happened next. That's what I wanted. I was so excited to find out what happened next. Now, I'd love to say that this was the book that then transformed my reading life. But unfortunately, it didn't. I think sometimes when I hear these stories of people looking for that one book that will turn a non-reader into a reader, that's not what happened with me. I enjoyed reading this book, but I didn't necessarily carry on. Now, it was a few years later, again, to do with a TV program, Sherlock Holmes. Now, I'm sure everybody is familiar with Sherlock Holmes. And there was a TV series, this particular one with Jeremy Brett, that was released in the 80s. And I loved this. And I was getting a bit older at this point. I was about, maybe about 15 or so when this was on. But I loved these stories so much so that I bought my own book. Now, this was possibly the first book that I actually bought for myself to read. And I wanted to read more about Sherlock. And there's probably a good few reasons why I enjoyed reading this book. And there's a picture there of the insides of it. That picture that I showed you earlier on of a page that looked very, very boring. Now, this page and these pages do look very different. There is some illustrations in there. Yes, I think he's got his squeaky toy again there back. Yes. Sorry about that. We're trying to tease him out of the kitchen. Yes, if you can hear me. But these were books that were reprinted from the original magazines where the Sherlock Holmes stories were printed in. So they looked a bit different. If you look at that page there, the writing is broken up. It's broken up by those fantastic pictures, those illustrations, but it's also broken up by columns as well. So reading this, just the mechanics of reading this, I found far easier. Sorry, he's been whisked out there if you can, yes. So my daughter's just taken him out the room there. So the mechanics of this was far easier, digestible amounts of paragraphs. Now, and also I think, not only have you got a fantastic story with great characters, but also these books were short stories. And I think that's one of the most crucial things. They were very, very short stories. And I remember very much so this feeling of satisfaction and even a little bit of surprise when I first finished the story, that I'd read a whole story in one go. This was something wonderful. This was something I'd never really done before. And I wanted to read more and read more. And that's what I did with the Sherlock Holmes stories. I did keep on reading these stories. And this is perhaps the point where I started to think that reading wasn't quite this torturous activity that it used to be. But I was, a bit late. I was, 15 when this started to happen. So when I did get to this point, reading wasn't the same kind of problem. Now, in later years, I read a lot more in the Air Force. I had a lot more, not necessarily free time, but, whenever I was traveling anywhere, I used to carry a book with me. I would read maybe when our jet went flying, waiting for it to come back. I always carried a book with me. So a book became much more part of my life. And I think that's when I sort of discovered that, not only was reading not that much more difficult anymore, but I ended up going to university. Which I wouldn't have been able to do, I think, when I was younger, because reading, if you're a non-reader, to read educational books, it's much more of a challenge. Not only have you got the complexities of what you are going to talk about, what you are going to, investigate, whether it's geography or history or whatever, but you've got to overcome this problem of reading. So it was only as I became a reader that, that this whole problem of education was less of a problem, because I did read. And then, when I married my wife, or met my wife, she was a reader. So we were around books all the time. She was always trying to find books for her class. And so books were just lying around the house. A little bit of maybe just switch that off for a little bit. So yes, so for the first time in my life, I was around books, and that made a big difference as well. Just seeing books on bookshelves, on tabletops, seeing my wife reading books, and she was always looking for books to engage her children, because her school was in a very deprived area, and a lot of the children that went to her school didn't have books at home. Came from families like myself who didn't read. So she was always trying to find the books that would engage these readers. And I found that they engaged me as well. These kind of stories that just got straight on with the action, no messing around, no fancy dialogue, no poetry or beauty in the words. People like me, we just wanted the stories. We just wanted to get straight into a good story. We weren't necessarily interested in their descriptions, or however beautiful they may be, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you're a more experienced reader, then those are the things that you can enjoy much more. And then this is, when I became a stay-at-home dad, as I said, and books became part of my job. So I got to read for the first time children's books with my daughter. So I discovered Roald Dahl, which I'd never read before. I'd maybe seen a few of the films, but I got to read these stories with my daughter, which was wonderful. I mean, one of my greatest memories, and I think no matter how old I'll be, I'll always think back to the time when we read Matilda. I mean, I'm sure lots of you will have read and have heard of Roald Dahl's Matilda, but this was even more special because I'd never read it. I'd never seen the film. And this was the first time my daughter had actually read the whole book to me. So instead of me reading stories to her, this was the first book that she read to me from start to finish over a period of a few weeks. And it was lovely seeing her reactions, seeing, the sense of wonder as she read them. Her eyes would widen and she'd put expressions into it, into the whole dialogue, into the whole story. And I so much wished that I could have done that when I was younger. I missed out on reading all these wonderful stories. I wish that I could have had those stories rattling around in my head when I was younger. I have got to experience them now, but I do think there's something very special about a young imagination. I think it's far freer and maybe less cynical than us adults. So this is why I am now so keen to get young people reading, and hopefully knowing from me, they will maybe at least, take some, take some, some benefits from the fact that I can, you can't always catch up reading, but to read when you're young and to have those stories in your head is even more special. So I've become a patron of reading at a local school in London, and I've been a beanstalk reader as well, which is somebody who goes into schools and reads one-on-one with the child. I mean, obviously we haven't been able to do that for quite a while, but to encourage them to enjoy stories, not to learn about the technicalities of reading, but to talk about stories and to enjoy stories, just like I used to do, sitting on my bed with my daughter, and we'd talk about the stories and we'd get excited about the stories, which is something that I didn't have when I was younger. So so what I'm going to do now is give you something to do. Okay, I've waffled on there a little bit more, so if I can go back up onto the share a screen. Because I talk to a lot of people who are readers now, who are, love reading. I've entered this world of books, and they do nothing but read by the sounds of it. And I try and explain to them, but not everybody is a reader. So this is my very unscientific reading spectrum here. So we've got on one side a non-reader, to right up at the other end to people who read all the time, every waking moment, and all those little bits in between. Reading when forced to, like I did when I was at school. That's the only time I read. Or read when you're given a book. If you're given a book for Christmas or a birthday present, you feel a little bit obliged to read it. Or those who only read on holiday. Now, that could be because that's the only time you've got time to read, and that's quite understandable. People who read occasionally, to people who read most nights, right up to people who read all the time. So if I can ask you, just to see how everybody, what kind of level everybody's on. When you were 10-year-old, so think back to when you were 10-year-old, where would you put yourself on that reading spectrum? Okay, so we're going to have a little poll here now. So we'll see how that comes about. So were you a non-reader? Yes. Did you like to read? Read every now and then. Did you enjoy reading? So quite common. Or were you a bookworm? So let's see what we come up with that. So this is when you were 10-year-olds. Okay, see what we've got out there. Because I would have put myself very much at the bottom end of this spectrum. I just never read books at all, or I only ever read them when I was forced to. So we're getting many results in.
Yep, they're coming in. So if you haven't voted already, click on the poll button and have a vote. 1 is I never read books when I was 10 years old, or 5 is on the upper end of the scale. I love to read. I was the bookworm in class. So I'll leave it up for a few more seconds and then we'll share the results.
Yes, just out of curiosity, just to see what you were all like when you were 10-year-old.
Sure, so I'll share the results now.
Right, okay then, right. Yes, I mean, can everybody see that? Is that up for everybody?
Yeah, they should be able to see it.
Okay, so yes, so basically when you're 10-year-old, so the biggest there is all enjoyed reading. All right, that's fantastic. So we've got somebody for, have always enjoyed those readings. A few people there never read books. Okay, so those people just like me then. I like to think you've done all right for yourselves. So it doesn't always time to catch up on the reading there. So okay, so that's interesting. Okay, so mostly everybody enjoyed, or a big percentage enjoyed reading quite often. So I'm going to ask the same question now, but where would you put yourself on the spectrum now? Regardless of how old you are, where would you put yourself now? Do you read more books? Do you read less books? It could be because everyone's so busy, you don't have time. There's a lot of teachers out there. I know how busy teachers are. You'd maybe, like to read more. It was a question I was possibly going to think about asking, would you like to read more? But I think everyone would maybe like to have the time to read a little bit more. So let's see how we get on with that. So How much do you read now?
It looks like in the chat box, someone has commented that they used to read the Enid Blyton books.
Right. Yes. Well, yeah, she wrote plenty of books, didn't she? So yes. Yes, yeah, very, very common. Yes, I've met a lot of authors. I think a lot of authors in particular started off with the Enid Blyton book. So yes, a lot of people have introduced themselves by saying that's where they started reading. So yes, very, very popular amongst authors. Right.
Okay, and here you go. I think this is quite a pandemic style answer.
Right, yes, yes. Okay, so we have dropped a little bit, only just there. So maybe reading a little bit less than you maybe have done in the past. So I think that goes to show. I mean, that could be, as you say, the pandemic. This maybe some have had more time to read, but because of everything going on, it has been difficult to focus. And I think that's something for non-readers, regardless of a pandemic. That's how some readers, that's how certainly I felt. I felt as if there was always something else going on in my mind. And even if I did have the time to read, I just couldn't get into a book. I would read the same thing, or you read the same paragraph over and over again. It wouldn't just go into my head because I was thinking about something else. So that could be, a result of that. Okay, excellent stuff. Okay, then. So yeah, so yes, just a little non-scientific kind of experiment. Just because I do meet people who seriously think everybody reads as much as they do, and they just don't. And it's one of the reasons why I want to talk about this, because when I have talked about this in front of people, I'll just switch this off for a second there. It's when I have been on panels for things, a lot of the people on panels, librarians and booksellers and authors, they talk about how they read Enid Blyton when they were 7, and it's kick-started a whole lifetime of reading. And then it gets to me, and I felt quite awkward by saying, I didn't read much. But then sometimes when I've mingled with other people, they've said, oh, it's how reassuring it is to hear that they've had the same experiences as me. So I think it's something to get out in the open. And this is what I've been trying to achieve by this, is by, for you to maybe understand that there are lots of reasons for why somebody might be a reluctant reader. And if you were somebody that didn't read much, then there are other people just like you out there. So yes, so I mean, I have talked quite a bit about my reading, but I haven't talked at all about my writing, because that's a whole other subject. So what led me to write these stories? Now, even though I didn't read much, I have always scribbled stories. I've always had ideas. It's maybe another reason why I've been distracted while reading these stories. So since I was published, I have been talking a lot about reluctant readers, and my first book was used a lot to encourage people to read. So this is when I was approached by Collins Big Cat. They wanted to do something new with their reading scheme, and my kind of maybe strange sense of humor kind of appealed to them, and also the fact that I had been a reluctant reader, really appealed to them as well, And even though these books are aimed for everybody, any youngster, any young reader can read them, we had a particular slant trying to encourage kids who don't normally read. So I tried to involve the things that I've talked about here. It was great that these are short stories, very short, snappy stories, like when I read the Sherlock Holmes stories, very short ones, to kind of, to hopefully encourage them so they could feel that sense of achievement when they finished the story. And I remember that very vividly. So having short stories was important, having wonderful artwork to break up the writing, having short, snappy pages, so that the pages were not scary pages. And for these stories to be so varied and different, we worked very hard in keeping every story as different as it could be from the next story, so that when somebody would want to pick up a next book, and it would be completely different. So, we tried very hard to do that. And hopefully, I mean, it would be up to yourselves to decide whether we achieved that or not. So, even though I didn't read much, I was always writing. So it is an absolute joy to be writing for hopefully people who who don't read much, and to try to encourage them not just to pick up one book, but to maybe, as a result of reading one book, to pick up another book, because that's the dream. That really is the dream. So yes, so very excited to have these being released, and because I am a writer. Big Cat have launched a writing competition, because I do think reading and writing go so well together. And I think another good way of finding what a reluctant reader wants to read about is to ask them to write a story, because they're more likely to write about the things that they are quite keen to read about. So, I mean, that's just a general kind of a thing. You know, if somebody was to write a story that has a crocodile in it, then, well, maybe they're interested in crocodiles. So if you could find a book about a crocodile, then that would be fantastic. But this story, this writing competition here is open to people all over the world, youngsters from 5 to 11. And you've got two choices here. You can either write a new story for Shinori and the Chaos Crew to add to the collection that's already there, to write their own version of a Chaos Crew story, which would be brilliant, or to maybe create a new character for the Chaos Crew. There's quite a few members of the Chaos Crew there. You know, I tried to put together a good team with different kind of abilities. So if your young reader can think of somebody else to put into the Chaos Crew, maybe they can put themselves into it. Maybe they could put a teacher into it. That would be up to them. So it would be wonderful seeing these stories, and the prizes would be for myself to narrate the stories that they've written, and even better than that, because one of the wonderful things about writing stories, and certainly writing these ones, has been seeing the artwork, because we've got such a fantastic illustrator, Amit. He's done such an amazing job that Amit will bring to life the character that this young person has created. So that is quite a prize in itself. So I'd be very interested to see what magic, because he always comes up with magical stuff, does Amit. So that's the writing competition there. So I would hope that people do, you know, enter that, and we'll maybe leave some of those details open. So we have got just some time for some questions. I want to say, first of all, thank you very much for listening. I hope this hasn't been too rambling. I did want to explain more my experiences, and I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight into, you know, why people don't always read books. I have banged on quite a bit, so I do apologize. I do appreciate you staying with us for this length of time. But if we do have some questions, is that right?
Yeah, brilliant. Before we move on to questions, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Chris, for talking about your life. I know sometimes it's quite difficult to share everything about yourself, but you really put yourself out there, and hopefully some of the teachers can relate to what you were talking about. So thank you so much. And also, if any of you are interested in taking part in the writing competition, we've left the details on this slide for you so you can take notes. But do now send through your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll move on to that. So I've got a few here, Chris. Right. Hopefully should be okay. What book do you wish you had read as a child?
Right. All right. Yes, that's right. Okay. I mean, I think there's so many books. I think, especially being an author now, you know, it's I do find that there's so many books that are written all the time. I think sometimes, you know, some people rely on the big names. I mean, I have mentioned Roald Dahl a few times, and J.K. Rowling always gets a mention. There are so many other authors, and I think, I mean, the current crop of authors. I mean, some of my favourite authors is Jennifer Killick. For example, Jennifer Killick writes these wonderful stories, very funny, very madcap kind of stories. And I think if I'd have read those when I was younger, it would have engaged me far earlier. You know, books wouldn't have been these scary, boring books. They would have been books that had my sense of humour, that had my my crazy ideas in there. So I do. So I think if I did have to choose, then there would be the Jennifer Killick's funny books, funny, crazy, wacky books, and then that would have got me reading, I think, far more earlier than it would have done reading maybe the more sort of boring books that I would maybe call them, the more descriptive books. I'm sure all very worthy, but I was always after funny and full of action and adventure.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, I don't know if you touched upon it already, but could you tell us a little more about the context of the Shenoy books and how it gets reluctant readers
right
drawn into them?
Right. Yes. Well, I mean, hopefully, yes. I mean, because I talked a lot about the TV programs that I enjoyed. So when I was approached by Big Cat, I thought, well, what things did I like when I was younger? Use my experience of being a reluctant reader. What would have got me reading? So I thought about, having, I mentioned the $6 Million Man there. I would have loved to have pressed a button and for the $6 Million Man to have appeared in the living room, and we would have went off and had some bionic adventures together. Because this is what happens in the Shenoy books. His favourite program is the Chaos Crew, and he has an app on his phone, because all young people have their phones now, don't they? Yeah, and there's an app that has a glitch. And when he presses this button, instead of just taking him to maybe watch a TV program or give him some information or a game about the Chaos Crew, it brings some of the Chaos Crew into his world. And he has adventures with these people, just like I wish that I could have had. So that's what I thought. I put myself in the position of a reluctant reader that I was, and think, what would I like? So that's what I've hopefully tried to bring into these stories. This world of TV that I love, and reluctant readers are often distracted by the TV, and kind of bring those two stories together. And I have the family involved in these stories as well. And because there's a link between this glitch, creates a bit of a link. Strange things start happening in Shenoy's world that are maybe connected to the Chaos Crew's world. And there's this evil baddie, and you've got to have a good evil baddie in some of the stories called Snare, and he's often up to no trouble. And it's always fun writing stories with quite an evil baddie in there as well, which usually gets his comeuppance. But I'm not giving any spoilers away there. But so that's what I try to do.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Also, if anyone was interested in getting some samples of the new books that have just come out, do drop us an email, and our email address is on the screen at the bottom, and we'll share them with you. We also have them on our Big Cat ebook library, so you can also sample them on there as well. And this is quite good because this moves us into the next question, Chris. Mm-hmm. They've asked, as international society is moving to primarily digital everything, do you think there is a difference in physical book reading versus digital book reading when readers are reluctant?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. I think this first came up a good few years ago when ebooks first hit the market, wasn't it? It was obviously the end of the book, the solid form of book, and it showed that it wasn't. And I think, the two can live quite happily next to each other. And I think purely on an ebook versus book kind of thing, it's, one's perfect for, maybe you're sitting on a train. If you're on a train journey, then an ebook is just easier to carry around if you're traveling. Whereas you might want a proper book and, sit in the house, sometimes it's hard to carry a big chunky book on a train, but in the house, it's perfectly fine. And I think over the last few years, it has shown that, ebooks have done quite well. They haven't, knocked, proper books. Well, it's proper books. I mean, the normal, the hard copy books off the bookshelves at all in any way that people were worried about. But yes, the world is turning much more digital, and children do like their phones and their iPads and things like that, and do get a lot of their information from this digital way. And I think if that's how children would prefer to read their books, if we've grown up with the older, with hard copies, then we're more used to that. But if that's how children access it, then I'm very much for that. I think, you know, as long as they're engaging with books in whichever way they want to, you know, then that's, I mean, that's fantastic. And I think, you know, certainly with the Shinoy books, you know, they've been very much prepared to be ebooks and to be accessible in that way. And that's, I think that's one of the knacks, is having as many books accessible to young people as we can, is the best way we can do it. And if they want to access it through phones or tablets, then yes, let's give them what the children want, as opposed to what we think they maybe should be reading and how they should be reading it. Let them have the choice. So hopefully, you know, hopefully it can all work together. It just depends on the situation. So I think digital and hard copies can live perfectly happy next to each other. Hopefully.
I agree. That's a great answer. Another question. So I know we're almost at the end of the session, but there's one here who says, I always read for my son since he was a newborn. Yet when it came for him to read, he hated it, and he's been hating it ever since. He's 13 and I'm still fighting with him to read. I really wish that if you're able to give me some tips on how to motivate him, maybe from your experience as well as being that child at one point.
Right. So, well, I mean, you've obviously certainly tried your best there. I mean, I think that's normally the advice is to introduce books and stories at a very early age. So you've obviously done the right thing there. I mean, this just goes to show how everybody is so different, isn't it? And that's why I didn't start this by trying to give anybody any advice and give you my own experiences, because there could be any number of reasons for why one person doesn't like stories or whatever. I mean, I suppose it depends on, you know, quite often it is the stories yourself. I'm sure you've maybe tried all ranges of different stories, and sometimes it's just finding that right story. As I explained earlier on, there was, you know, that first book that I did read, I really enjoyed it, but it didn't open the floodgates in the way that I think some people expect it to be. Mine was very much over a period of years, and it took a little bit longer with the Sherlock Holmes stories, because the TV, you know, I was invested in that, and the books, it just had that kind of right connection there. And I suppose, I mean, you know, if your son's 13 now, that, you know, it's getting to quite an awkward age regardless, isn't it, for things. You know, I know how that the relationship with my daughter in terms of reading did change during those times, and I do miss those times, you know, reading with her. But I think that's part of parenthood, isn't it? We've got to expect that and go along with that. So I mean, I suppose just keep providing a range of books and opportunities for your son to keep reading. You know, if there is something that he is interested in, you know, maybe, you know, chuck a few books in his direction. You know, it's not easy. It's you know, the point of this, what I'm trying to say is that there are so many different avenues and so many different ways and so many different reasons why somebody might not be reading. So I'm sorry if that's not much help, but I do appreciate, and you know, everything you've done for your son there, and I hope you just keep going, and I'm sure, you know, that persistence will pay off. So good luck.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we've come to the end of the time now, so thank you very much, Chris, again, and thank you everyone for listening. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you again soon.
Yes,
so take care.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.